Okay, so it is a few minutes after 1, so I think we should probably begin. All right, so hello. Welcome to the Haag Streit Lenstar webinar for technicians. My name is Carrie Menard, and I am a clinical application specialist for the Lenstar. Joining me today is my colleague Kirsten Stumpo. She is also a clinical application specialist, and she will be assisting me with the presentation. So this webinar will be about 45 minutes long with available time at the end for questions to be answered. So if you do have a question even throughout the presentation, please just type it in either the Q&A box or the chat area, and we will make sure it is addressed at the end of the webinar. I just also wanted to let you know we do have another webinar this evening at 5:30 Eastern Standard Time. And that webinar is going to be hosted by Kirsten, and it will dive further into deciphering bad measurements, difficult cases, lens calculations, adding lenses, and modifying templates. So if you would like to attend and you have not already yet registered, please visit the Haag Streit USA Haag Streit Academy website and visit the live webinars section. All right, so let's jump right in. Okay, so first I wanted to begin by identifying that there are 2 different generations of our Lenstars. So our first generation Lenstar is what we call a green light Lenstar. So it adds this overall hue to the image, like this green tone. Whereas the image on the right is taken from one of our white light Lenstars, where you can identify the white sclera in the iris and blood vessels very well. So both of these versions do provide you with the same measurements, but within my PowerPoint, I'm going to be sharing images and screenshots from our newer white light unit. So I did want to show the difference for our older green light users listening in that your pictures may look a little bit different. So another difference between our devices is the Lenstar APS versus the Lenstar Pro. So APS stands for Automated Positioning System. So this mode acquires measurements using groundbreaking dynamic eye tracking. So this takes the user-to-user variability between technicians out. It also allows the technicians to be hands-free to either assist with eyelid height or keeping your patient's forehead to the bar. If you do not have the model with that APS feature, then you have a Lenstar Pro, which still provides you with the same measurements, only the technician has to do all the work from the beginning to the end, including following your patient's measurements. And I would like to point out that if you do have a white light Pro, so the image on the right in the previous slide in a manual mode Lenstar, you are able to upgrade your unit to that automatic positioning system or APS. If you are interested in more information on APS upgrades or our green light trade-in program, please, our contact information will be listed at the end of our PowerPoint. So let's jump right into measurement acquisition and then discuss cautions on your measurements. So here are measurements taken in APS. So notice the technician will start defocused, meaning all the way back closest towards them, and they're going to move closer towards the patient until those 32 circles here, right in the front of the cornea, start to look crisp and clear. When they look clear, the technician is going to pause and click the joystick button. Now you'll notice a red light here. They're going to keep going forward closer towards your patient's eye until that red light turns green. At that point, the automatic mode kicks in, so your technician is hands-free. The device is following your patient, doing the measurement, and there's a flash. It's going to continually measure 5 or 6 times, depending on how or what the value is in your settings. And it's tracking your patient's eye movement. So if they start to wiggle or move around or blink, it's going to pause and only measure when it's in the correct position. So notice I do have a caution on that 4th measurement, and we're going to discuss cautions in just a couple of slides away, but I want to emphasize that you do not need to instantly delete and rescan. because we're going to talk about efficiency throughout this webinar. Okay, so the next video that I am going to share will demonstrate measurement mode manually. So if you have an automatic device, so our APS unit, there will be an icon on your top toolbar that is a blue square with 4 arrows and 2 gears. When that blue is present, it means that you are in APS or automatic mode. However, when you click that icon and that blue goes away, you are in manual mode. So I'm going to show you manual mode measurements in either APS, or if you do have a Lenstar Pro, the model with just manual mode, your measurements will look like this. Technician will begin starting defocused all the way back towards them, and then they'll center on your patient's eye and move closer towards them until those 32 points look clear, and then click the button. Now you'll notice at this point they'll go closer towards the eye, and it is important that you want these double parentheses to be clear. That is your first goal in the manual mode, is identify these clear parentheses, and then you're going to start to see these arrows. And these arrows will help you refine the distance away from the eye. Now the little arrow up top says go closer towards your patient, and a larger arrow on the bottom, like this one here, says come back. But you can ignore these arrows when you have a green circle size, smaller than the size of a quarter, like the coin, and that white light is well centered in this crosshair. At that point, when you have those 2 points, you can ignore the arrows and click the joystick button to measure. Measurement will go around, and here is a flash at the end. The technician will have to click again, and then when they're in good position, they will click in the measurement. Now notice this, when your patient moves, the biometer will pause. So the Lenstar has safeties in its measuring features that it will not measure in the poor position. Just like here, the technician will have to go closer towards your patient's eye until that green light is present, and it will continue to measure. Okay, and we're looking for 32 nice crisp circles here. We want those all to be present, and if they're not, we would advise our patients to blink and open. Okay. All right, so we just watched measurement acquisitions. So as you know, the Lenstar is an optical biometer which uses optical low coherence reflectometry with an 820 superluminescent diode laser, which projects the light or the laser into the eye, picking up on reflective surfaces. So as you notice in this brief PowerPoint presentation, the first spike of the cornea represents the anterior surface of the cornea, which includes the tear film. The second spike represents the posterior cornea. Difference between those is corneal thickness. Then we go through the aqueous depth, and that third spike represents the first spike of your lens, so the anterior aspect of your lens. We go through your lens to hit the posterior aspects of your lens, and then we go through the vitreous to reach the retina. And the last 2 spikes represent the inner limiting membrane, and lastly, the retinal pigment epithelium. So the distance between all of these points give us our various measurements. So here are the measurements that the Lenstar acquires. What you may not realize is that one scan reflects off the retinal pigment epithelium 16 times. So if we take 5 measurements, like previously in those videos, that's 80 reflections being used for each of these biometry measurements. Because we take 5 measurements, we measure 16 internal scans. So this 2183 is an average of 80 axial lengths, 80 corneal thicknesses, 80 anterior chamber depths or aqueous depths, and 80 lens thicknesses. So we're getting a lot of measurements. And if we jump down to the keratometry, when we measure 5 times, each set is containing 4 measurements. So each time we measure, it's 5, and then each time we measure, we're taking 4 internal sets times 5 measurements, so that will be 20. We're also measuring the white to white and the pupil diameter as well. Okay, so do you remember on that first video we saw, there was a caution on our 4th scan here. So before we instantly right-click and delete, let's review our average Ks. So we have 40.09, 40.08, 40.13, 40.17, and 40.06. So these averages are very consistent, even though you have a triangular caution on that 4th scan. So if you're not already, we recommend that you're reviewing your standard deviations. So a standard deviation is a measure that's used to quantify the amount of variation between your measured values. So we want our standard deviations to be low, which confirms our measurements are consistent. So our axial length should have a standard deviation less than 0.1. And both of our Ks should have a standard deviation of less than 0.25. But we also need to be sure that the axis has a standard deviation of less than 3.5, but only if your patient is a toric lens candidate. So let's look at the standard deviations of this measurement. Okay, so our axial length has a deviation of 0.016, which is less than 0.1. Our flat K has a standard deviation of 0.052, which is also less than a quarter. Our steep K has a standard deviation of 0.127, which is also less than a quarter. And our astigmatism has a standard deviation of 3.5. Now we want to look at the amount of astigmatism to determine if your patient is a candidate for a toric lens. So this patient has about a diopter, so they may be a candidate for a toric lens. So because this number is right at 3.5, I may want to tighten up that standard deviation on our next screen. And I'll show you those steps involved. But it does not mean that you need to delete instantaneously this 4th measurement and then remeasure, because we can save you time for the practices that are deleting these and rescanning to review your measurements after. Okay, so when we want to look back at previous measurements that were scanned, we're going to select our patient in iSuite, and then we're going to look at this examination history. So notice this little biometer icon would be what I want to click into, but I want to first show you these little plus symbols next to the measurement and next to the IOL calculation. So I can see the date and time stamp for each of those and which eyes were measured or had calculations on. So we would want to review our standard deviations. So our K1 is 0.096 and our K2 is 0.081. So for this patient, both of those values are less than 0.25. Our astigmatism amount is only 0.27. So this patient would not be a candidate for a toric lens. So I will not be concerned with that 6.7 value. So when I click into the numbers and I open up this keratometry display, we want to look at our images here. So in this display, I'd like you to take note that for each scan, there is a potential for 32 reflective data points, and those are imaged over 4 times. So that's a potential for 640 points over the course of 5 scans to be utilized in your patient's IOL calculations. So triangular cautions will appear when there are not enough reflective points. Therefore, a triangular caution will appear next to measurements when either the patient blinked too much or there is maybe an eyelid or lashes interfering or limiting the number of data points. But if you notice on the scan, the patient blinked. So in our first and fourth box here, we have some blinks. So we would like to look at the remaining images, okay? So note that there are 32 good reflective keratometry points indicating adequate tear film, and our center reflection point here confirms that the patient was fixated well because we were able to see that very nicely. And when we compare these measurements to the 4 remaining measurements, they're very consistent. Our standard deviations are extremely low and less than the guidelines. So would we have to delete and remeasure this scan if we were measuring our patient? No, not in this case, okay? However, if your keratometry images are missing points in all of the displays, like this one here, that is ground to question the scan. And then if all of your scans appear like this, so when you click through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then the patient should be rescanned. Anytime your scans are highlighted in pink or red, there are either too many outliers or your outliers are too extreme. So it's recommended that you right-click on that pink or red scan, select delete, and then you would want to remeasure. So let's zoom into this standard deviation display to review these measurements together. So notice the standard deviations for these K measurements are 0.374 and 0.724. So by deleting this first scan in this measurement set, where this average K is a diopter flatter than the 4 remaining, and then remeasure that patient, as long as that remeasured scan is closer to these other 4 value sets, then our standard deviations would be reduced and we wouldn't have the scan in pink. Okay, so we do encourage you to delete these pink measurements and rescan. Now, I would like to point out one more thing on this image. So we have this circular caution on our axial length. So we will see these will appear in iSuite in either your axial length or your keratometry measurements. A circular caution next to axial length indicates that there is a difference between your eyes, between both eyes, greater than 0.3 millimeters. A circular caution next to keratometry values differ. One means that indicate that the keratometry values differ 1 diopter or more between 2 eyes. All right, so I am going to now open up my iSuite. Okay. So when reviewing our patients, we are going to review our standard deviations. Okay. So let's look at an example of when our standard deviations are higher than the recommended guidelines. So when we review your patient's measurements, it is recommended that we start with our standard deviations first and not our cautions. Okay, so this is important because if you attempt to reduce the standard deviations and cannot get these values below 0.25 or the astigmatism below 3.5 with at least 3 scans remaining, then after the measurements, you would have a tab here that says measuring, and you can click back to that measuring tab and delete scans and remeasure. And I do have a video to show that concept after we review standard deviations and cautions together. So remember, you want your standard deviations to be low, which confirms that the measurements are going to be consistent. So for our axial length, we want this value to be less than 0.1. So I would ask myself, is 0.13 and 0.013 and 0.014 less than 0.1? And the answer is yes. Then I would look down to our flat Ks and look to see if 0.144 and 0.04 are less than 0.25, in which they are. For our seat Ks, or K2, I look at these two values to see if these are less than 0.25. Now we have 0.42 and 0.28, so both of these are greater than a quarter. So what I can do is click into that value, and it will open the keratometry display. And I want to ensure that I'm working in the appropriate column. So if you notice, the standard deviations are listed below. So this 0.14 for the standard deviation for my keratometry, this is an appropriate value. So this is not the column I want to be working in. It's actually this one here because my deviation is 0.422. So in order to identify an outlier in this column, I can click this little arrow and it will sort my column in numeric order. And depending on how many times I click it, it will sort it from smallest to biggest or biggest to largest. Smallest to biggest or biggest to smallest. So when I scan down this column, I'm going to look for an outlier. When I see that outlier, I can double click and then reevaluate my standard deviation. So my deviation is now 0.20. So that is less than a quarter. So I have identified my outlier and I can click OK. Let's do the same on our left eye. So we have 0.288. I click into that value. I remembered it was my K2 column, so I click my arrow. I scroll down looking for my outlier. The one that I believe it is, I double click, and my deviation has reduced to be less than 0.25. Now, if this value didn't bring it down enough, I can do one of two things. I can re-include it and try another value to see how that adjusts my deviation. Notice this, now it is now 0.26. So that one did not bring it down enough. Or you may try to eliminate or exclude two values, but you need to leave 3 values remaining. And if you do not have 3 values remaining, iSuite will flag a caution on your measurement. But just excluding this one value, putting this line through it, my standard deviation is less than a quarter. So I'm happy and I can click OK to proceed. Okay. All right, now for your astigmatism, it is recommended to have a discussion with your physician to determine at what point they consider a patient a candidate for a toric lens. So if your physician says that they will consider their patient a toric lens candidate if there is 0.75 diopters of astigmatism or more, then that would be the value you use to identify your patients here. For simplistic purposes today, I am going to use 1 diopter. So when reviewing these results, I would ask myself, is 1.62 greater than a diopter, which is 1.0? If my answer is yes, then I will look over here to confirm that the deviation is less than 3.5, which it is because it's 2.4. However, on my left eye, my amount of astigmatism is 0.57. So that is less than a diopter. So I am not concerned with this value of 5.6 for this standard deviation because my patient will likely not be a toric lens candidate. Okay. So let's move on to some cautions. All right. Now, when reviewing our measurements, like I previously mentioned, it is important to start with your standard deviations first. So I would make sure my axial length deviation is less than 0.1, which it is, and I would make sure my flat and steep K are less than 0.25, which the flat is, however, my steep is greater than 0.25. So I will click into that value organize my column and look for an outlier, double click when I believe it is that one, confirm my standard deviation has reduced below that quarter, and click OK. For my astigmatism, the patient has a less than a diopter for the amount, so I do not need to be concerned with this 15.2. So when looking at our cautions, let's start with our central corneal thickness, our CCT. When I click into the value next to the caution, this will open our histogram display. So the corneal thickness caution, the CCT, I can resolve this caution one of two ways. I can organize the column to put it in numeric order and identify an outlier and double click. And if my caution goes away, then I have the correct outlier. If I exclude the wrong value, my caution remains. So that's a little test method. The other way you can resolve your caution is hovering the crosshair of your cursor over the crosshair of the posterior corneal gate, and then click and then drop to reconfirm the placement that that is the posterior corneal spike. So we can fix that one of two ways. Now notice we also have a lens thickness caution here. So it is best to use the zoom scan feature when evaluating your lens thickness or aqueous depth caution. So currently my cursor is a black crosshair, but if I hover over the fourth icon, it says zoom scan. I can click that icon and my cursor then changes to a double-headed arrow. Now if I hover between, in the aqueous depth area between my cornea and my lens, I can click with my mouse, drag over the lens past gate in question, and then let go. And now it will be zoomed into my lens. Now notice this little black circle here. It's supposed to best represent the very start and the very end of your lens to best represent the measurement of your lens thickness. However, it fell a little bit inside. So I can adjust this by hovering my crosshair over the crosshairs of the gate, clicking and dragging, and I can drag it up out of the way and then dissect this line with the last spike that I see with multiple colors, and then drop. When I have multiple colors here, that confirms that I had confident measurements all in that area, and I drop. Now I do not have an aqueous depth caution, but if I had, I can do the same by clicking and bringing it up and dropping it on the last spike of multiple colors. We do recommend that you use this fifth icon, which is Fit Scan to Window, to zoom out at the end and then just review your placement of these gates to verify. Now, I would like to point out here that the front gate of the cornea is fixed. You cannot move that one, and you will never ever want to adjust the retinal gates. Okay, so only these three. When I click OK, you'll notice that I have asterisks at the end of my values. So you'll notice an asterisk here when either your standard deviations were modified or if gates were manipulated. So that single asterisk is a flag to the doctor that the value was user defined. We also have a double asterisk here indicating that it's a system constant because in Europe, the FDA has allowed them to measure the retinal thickness. So in Europe, these devices will measure retinal thickness. But if you're listening in from the United States, our devices in the US will always show 200 microns. Okay. All right. So when we want to evaluate either white to white or pupillometry cautions, we can click into the values. Now notice this icon I have not showed you yet is this blue cyclic arrow, and it's going to revert all your measurements back to where the Lenstar had them. Okay, so when we're reviewing this scan, I do want to show you this as well. Now the lens gates, sometimes you'll notice very tall peaks and sometimes they will be shorter. So when we have a caution on lens thickness, we can use this fourth zoom scan icon and zoom into that area. And this is where I'm going to hover. And I do see at least 3 colors there. So that's confirming multiple colors for me. And I'll drop it right at that point. And if you ever have a question about where you're placing these gates, or maybe it's the keratometry section, on each of our displays, there is a print icon. So you can print these displays and show them to your physicians and have them confirm or validate. The other option is you can contact Haag Streit Tech Support for review stations so your surgeons can review these values right from their exam lane. Okay, so I would like to show you after, of course, I would have emphasized my standard deviations and adjusted those first. But let's jump down to our white to white and pupil cautions. So notice I do have a caution on my white to white, so I'm going to click into that value. So if this is ever zoomed in, you can use the icon, the fourth one in, that's fit image to window. So that will zoom out. So when we review our measurements, I have a 5 millimeter, and then I have a bunch of 12s. So I can double click to exclude that value, or I could look at the photographic image of that white to white. So notice my caliper is resting very high and not best representing my horizontal limbus of my white to white. But I can manually adjust that by hovering my cursor over the caliper edge and then clicking and dragging and dropping it right on the horizontal limbus of each. My caution is now gone, and I can click OK. And there's that little asterisk for your physician. Now notice I do not have pupillometry measurements. So sometimes this will occasionally happen if your pupillometry measurements are too small or irregular. But I can click into this display to review my pupillometry measurements, and I can enlarge this caliper or drag it out to encompass that pupil, and then come over here to the right and re-click to bring those measurements in. And I can do the same on the second measurement and re-click, as well as the third. And re-click. Now notice I only need 3 in order to not have a caution. So that's the minimum number in iSuite. I can drag this one down, re-click, drag this one down, re-click. Okay, and now I have 3 without a caution. All right, so in regards to pupils, we do also recommend having a conversation with your physicians to determine if they are not reviewing this pupillometry data. And it may save you time by not having to review and adjust these measurements if they're not looking at them either. So pupillometry is like a sunroof in a car. It can be a nice feature, but it's not necessary to make your vehicle drive. So similarly in ophthalmology, pupillometry is used for your physicians to quantify or qualify your patient for a multifocal lens. But if your physicians are not interested in reviewing these numbers, then you do not have to take the extra time to adjust these gates or review if you do not have pupillometry measurements. Okay. I'm going to jump back to my PowerPoint now. Actually, I did want to show you one more thing in iSuite. And I'm just gonna make sure you guys can see that. Okay. The last thing I did want to show I wanted to emphasize the point where sometimes we have cautions that will remain even after you print these, this page or do your calculations for your doctor. So notice we have a white-to-white caution here. I will click into those values. And if I look through my patient images, he or she had closed their eye for all of the measurements. However, on this last scan, I do have a caliper ring representing, as best as I can see, this horizontal limbus. So remember, iSuite, or the software, does require 3 measurements for the overall average. However, if you're manually adjusting the white to white, according to this photographic image on just 1 measurement, technically isn't that an accurate measurement? So if you need to adjust the white to white with only 1 adjusted measurement and eliminate the rest, you will still have a caution remaining. Okay. And then same thing on pupillometry here. It can be treated the same way. If there are less than 3 measurements, it will give you a caution on that pupillometry measurement. Okay. But again, you're utilizing this photographic image to best represent the edge of this caliper. So this may be a situation as well where these cautions may continue to remain on your measurements. Now, another instance where you may see a caution remain on your measurements is our dense cataract mode. So if you've ever experienced difficulty measuring very dense cataracts, you may have noticed a caution on your axial length measurement. And we all know that light cannot pass through every material out there. So if you are attempting to measure a rock, you will likely need to use sound versus light. However, the Lenstar does have a dense cataract mode that will kick in automatically. So remember that the laser has to pass through a dense lens twice. So if there is a lot of disruption, the reflection coming back through that second time will be much weaker. And this indicates for the Lenstar to click into this dense cataract mode instead of displaying an axial length measurement for the first 3 scans. So the software is actually utilizing an algorithm to create a composite axial length value. So if additional scans are performed after the first 3, it will continue to build on that composite axial length. So when you receive an axial length with a caution and no standard deviation like we see here, that will tell you that that axial length is based on a composite from a dense cataract mode measurement. So we recommend clicking into that axial length to review the A-scan or histogram. And when you see at the times when you see an axial length that does not have a standard deviation or has a caution. So when the retinal spikes are spread out and variable like this one, it would be a good idea to do an ultrasound to confirm the axial length. And again, the laser has to pass through that lens twice. So the denser the lens, it causes more disruption of light, which therefore weakens the signal. Now, when you have retinal spikes that are in uniform, such as this, you can have more confidence in the composite axial length value. So also while measuring, this technician in this case was measuring slightly decentered or off axis. which was able to allow 3 additional scans to be achieved here. The Lenstar had crossed those out automatically due to the dense cataract mode, but the technician can double-click and re-include these values to help validate that composite axial length, because it will provide us with a standard deviation. So that's what we had done here. Double-clicked to re-include those, and it now shows us a standard deviation. So to summarize dense cataract mode, when you have a caution on your axial length measurement and no deviation, it's recommended to click into the axial length to open up the histogram to evaluate your retinal spikes. When you have a retinal spike that is in uniform and narrow, and the axial length compares well to your fellow eye, it is likely a confident scan, and you can proceed forward to your IOL calculations. However, if you have any hesitation or lack of confidence, it never hurts to perform an ultrasound. But if you click into this histogram display and your retinal spikes are spread out and variable like this one, it would be a good idea to do that ultrasound scan to confirm the axial length. Okay. I just wanted to show this slide to show that this would be the first indication of dense cataract mode. So this yellow highlighted bar notates the composite axial length achieved in dense cataract mode. Okay, so this video I'm about to show you will further explain the process of measuring, then reviewing your standard deviations, and being able to go back to the measuring mode. Okay. So we just finished measuring this patient's right eye. The operator clicks finish, which leads them to the results overview screen. Now we do have one caution here, but they're going to review their deviations. Now because of screen recording limitations, what you're not seeing is another display populates here, and the technician excluded one of the K1 or K2 measurements on that 5th scan. When they clicked OK, they can then click the top left back to measuring. The box would populate saying, do you want to repeat new measurements? You hit no. And then here, you'll notice that what we had, an axial length average, keratometry average here, it crosses it out, which indicates that was the scan that they had adjusted. So this allows the user to delete and rescan that measurement in order to readjust the deviations should they have to. And this would only be utilized if when reducing your standard deviations, if you cannot get your K1 and K2 less than 0.25 or your axis less than 3.5 if your patient is a candidate for a toric lens. Now this video next that I'd like to show you, actually I wanted to point this out. On your measuring screen, we do have this drop down here, so you can change from summary and show flat K or steep K or axis. So instead of just looking at the axial length and the average K, you can utilize this drop down to look at the steep meridians or the flat meridians, etc. In this last video I'd like to show you emphasizes the point that you would never want to adjust your gates before your deviations. Because if you ever want to try to remeasure, if you've already adjusted your gates, your measurement screen will be blank. And I'll show you what I mean. So we just finished measuring 5 measurements. We click finish. On this screen, the operator will click into the lens thickness area and a box will open, and they're actually going to adjust the lens thickness spike here. Once they adjust that, they jump back to this measuring display up top, and notice your screen is now blank. Now, this does not mean that your measurements are erased for good. They will still be saved under your patient home area So you could go back to patient and then go to your exam. But if you needed to repeat these measurements in order to reduce your deviations, you would need to do a full 5 set on each eye again. Okay. So to summarize, in order to be more efficient when you're starting back up after this potential shutdown that you may be going through, you do want to delete and rescan your pink or red measurements. Remember, this indicates that there are either too many outliers or your outliers are too extreme. You do not want to automatically delete measurements with cautions on the keratometry. Instead, you would want to evaluate your standard deviations and then proceed forward and look at your keratometry display to look at those 32 reflective keratometry points, see if they're nice and bright, which indicates adequate tear film, and that there is a nice center reflection point present, indicating your patient was fixated. It's recommended that you evaluate your standard deviations on your measurement screen and then your cautions on your results overview screen. And this is because after your measurements are completed, the display below the summary display at the bottom shows just the keratometry and the axial length. So it's much more simplified. And it can be faster to review your standard deviations there and then click finish and your cautions on the next screen. We recommend that you review your dense cataract mode histograms to identify if either immersion or A-scan measurements are necessary. So remember, a caution on that axial length without a standard deviation indicates that the measurement was in dense cataract mode, and it can help reduce the number of immersions or A-scans that your office is completing by evaluating your histogram graph to determine if your retinal spikes are uniform and narrow or if they're widespread and variable. So if you're interested in this document, please send us an email with that request. Our emails will be listed on the next screen. This is a validation guide that we made, and on the first page, it has step-by-step directions for your standard deviations. And on the second page, it has step-by-step directions on how to adjust cautions and how to review those. Okay, it's a really great guide. So here's our contact information. If you would like a PDF emailed copy of that guide, please email Kirsten or I. If you have further interest on either an APS upgrade or our Greenlight trade-in program, please contact either Tanya Lay or our customer service number listed. And we're actually offering a discounted remote training promotion right now until the end of May. So where Kirsten or I or one of our colleagues would work directly with you and your colleagues remotely on your Lenstar. So if you'd like more information on that, please contact one of us. So at this point, I would like to take some time to answer those questions that you may have. I did see a lot of chats coming in throughout that PowerPoint. So Kirsten, why don't you let me know what we have?
Yeah, Carrie, the first question that I think we should probably address is from Michael. He was asking, let me read his question. He said, can we look also at how the Lenstar gives 2 different green circles, one of which works, one that does not? I asked him to elaborate, and I think what he's talking about is the over-focusing that you can sometimes do with the Lenstar. You want to go over that?
Why don't you run with that one if you're understanding him, because I'm not grasping it right away.
Okay, yeah, so I think what is happening is when you're going in and focusing, and if you could briefly show that video too of focusing, that would be great to have running in the background there. Oop. Yeah, manual mode is probably fine. But when you're doing the initial focus alignment, you're going towards the patient until you get separated 32 keratometry data points. Then you click the button again.
Right?
Yes, yes, okay. I think so. Yeah, so that first initial focus alignment, it's pretty big movement because you're adjusting your gross focus, so big movement. And then after that, once you get those 32 keratometry reflections separated, you click the button, and then you go into a fine focus. So these are very little movements, but in the more modern versions of the Lenstar, we now have those double parentheses, and those double parentheses are directly related to the distance of the Lenstar to the patient's eye. So as long as you have those double parentheses, you're in appropriate distance from the eye. However, if you get too close and you have single parentheses, you can actually trick the biometer into thinking that the lens is actually the cornea, and you'll measure the eye too short or too close, and you will get a caution that pops up on the screen indicating such. Also, you want to go over, Carrie, a little bit about the iris barycenter and the pupil barycenter?
Sure. So, probably be best if I show my iSuite software. So the iris barycenter or pupil barycenter can best be utilized if a surgeon is evaluating a patient for a multifocal lens. So when we're looking at the barycenters here, and I'm going to click into one of my pupillometry measurements, these X and Y coordinates best represent where this patient's visual axis is in relation to the center of my patient's pupil. So it can be a quick tool for your surgeons to look at these coordinates to say, is my patient a multifocal lens candidate, or is their visual axis a bit too deviated from central, and they may have more complaints after a multifocal lens if we utilize one. And the white to white, very similar. So it is going to be the center of your horizontal limbus here compared to your pupil. Okay.
And just to touch on that, again, so the white to white, iris barycenter, the X and Y are giving us an idea of the distance between the center of the cornea essentially and the visual axis. So you can relate that to angle alpha. You were going to go into pupillometry, weren't you?
That's okay. I don't want to jump too depth into this. I think the angle alpha and kappa would be more appropriate for the 5:30 webinar.
Yes, and I do go over that. However, we had a couple questions about it. So, and they are in India, so it's going to be difficult for them to join that 5:30. So I thought I'd throw that in there. So the pupil barycenter is similar, but gives us an idea of angle kappa. I hope that helps. I've got some more questions here. Can the gates be changed later? And can you turn the dense cataract mode on and off?
So answering the first question, the gates can be changed later. So if we look back at this measurement, this scan is from 2016. And I can click into this measurement and adjust these gates later. So they can always be done at a later date or time. And the technician or the physician always has the capability to click in here to see what was adjusted by this little hand. And they can always reset back to where the Lenstar had the measurements to by clicking this blue cyclic arrow and clicking OK, and it will revert those changes. And the second question, Kirsten, what was that? Oh, dense cataract mode, on and off.
Mode be turned on and off.
So it cannot. You cannot turn it on and off. It will automatically kick in based on the strength of those signal scans. But if you ever are questioning the dense cataract mode measurement, you could theoretically delete the composite value and try to rescan. For our automatic or our APS Lenstars, we do encourage you to turn the APS feature off if you do have a dense cataract patient in dense cataract mode clicking in, and you can measure in manual mode and try to aim off axis slightly while still having a green circle to try to acquire additional axial length measurements. Okay, Kirsten?
Yes. Can can you show the display of our emails again so that people can get a and use your phone and take a snapshot of that, or if you're good with your computer, take a snipping tool shot of that and keep it on hand too.
Yes. And if you have questions that maybe are more pertinent to your office, please feel free to contact us. Or if you have questions that we are not able to address in our time limit, please let us know as well. You can email us.
We do have another question, Carrie. What is the penetration in percentage in the U.S. population?
The percentage for dense cataract mode? I would imagine that question is. So we like to, our understanding from a clinical application specialist is that we are in the mid-90s, low to mid-90s for our measurement penetration for our dense cataract mode scan. And if you'd like to touch on that, Kirsten, you can.
No, you did good. Oh, thank you, Bob. I do believe there will be a copy that we can share. We had a question if this webinar can be emailed, and I think so. So if you want a copy of this webinar, please email us. Glad to help,
and
Diana.
Yes, there is a flash. There is a flash at the end of both automatic APS and manual mode measurements. And actually what we're hearing is our software update in the fall, the flash intensity should be easier for your patients with a software update. So I see some questions in the Q&A. I see that someone's having smiley face emoticons or a frowny face under the measurements. So that is a setting that we normally turn off. It is an image quality check. And if you email us, we can help you turn off that in your settings. Essentially, it is indicating if you have all 32 reflection points showing. And if even one of those are not present, or if your patient blinks, you're going to get a lot of those frowny face emoticons, and it's actually provides a lot of confusion to our technicians. So we normally turn those off because they have no relation as to the actual quality of the measurements or the data. So actually,
we had another question. Piggyback lens calculation is possible?
Not within the Lenstar. So we recommend that you go online to do additional calculations on an online resource. And I'm not sure if we are going to have access to these chats after this webinar is completed. So if you are asking for us to email you, I'm going to try to copy all of these. But just in case, please send us an email. And any ideal standard deviation to proceed with a toric lens. So we recommend that your keratometry deviation, so your K1 and K2, are less than 0.25. And your astigmatism, if they're going to be a candidate for a toric lens, would be less than 3.5. Kirsten, do you want to jump on explaining silicone oil filled measurements? I know you touch upon that later this evening as well.
Carrie, I'm having a little trouble hearing you. You're kind of breaking up all of a sudden.
Oh, really? Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you touch on silicone oil measurements so that I don't pick up?
Can you chat that in the chat box so I know what you're saying? Oh, the silicone oil. Oh, yeah, of course. So when you are measuring and you know the patient has silicone oil in the vitreous at the time of the measurement, you do want to switch your setting, your measurement mode setting, to the silicone oil. I hope that answers your question. If not, did someone ask that?
Yes, in the Q&A.
Oh, I missed that. I've been trying to stay on top of these.
And can we measure, can you hear me again, or am I still garbled?
You're kind of garbled.
Oh,
How do you change to silicone oil setting? Oh, okay, so you can actually do that before or after the measurement. So in the measuring screen, and Carrie, do you have an example you could pull up? In the measuring screen. Okay, so that's in the biometry screen. And you have that little icon there in the A-scan display. And when you click on that, it gives you the option to change your lens material or vitreous body. So this is after the measurement. So this is really cool about the Lenstar because you can change these settings after the patient's gone. So if you forgot, or maybe you didn't even know, you can go back in, open the biometry information, and change that setting here. Once you click OK, it's going to ask you if you want to lose all settings, and you certainly say OK because you're going to utilize now a different index of refraction based on oil present at the time of the measurement. You also have the option to change that in the measuring screen. So there that icon is again. So if you know beforehand, certainly select it here, but you can do it after the fact as well. Carrie, go ahead and move to a calculation. I have a question here. Can you manually input immersion calculations? And this is where you can do that. When you click on the IOL icon on the left-hand side to start a new calculation, you can enter your immersion axial length here.
If you are measuring with immersion, you can leave this setting as optical, but if you do have that contact A scan, then you would want to change this value to acoustic. So immersion and optical can utilize the same constants. I have an anonymous attendee, I hope I sound okay, asking what we feel is good parameters to set regarding toric lenses, for example, 0.75 or 1.0. We do recommend falling back on the surgeon. There are certainly different cases with the toric calculators where a patient with 0.8 diopters of astigmatism will call for a toric lens, depending on their steep axis. And there's some cases where 1.2 diopters will call for a non-toric lens. So we definitely recommend talking with your surgeon and utilizing review stations from iSuite so that you can always have them review the measurements and adjust should they need to. And I'm not sure if you guys know, we do have a toric calculator within iSuite. So if you're interested in the toric calculations at all, please email us and we can provide you with more information on our calculator. So you can back data up into an Excel format. It's called our recorder. So yes, email us and we can help you with that guide. Can we actually measure retinal thickness? Not in the United States. It's not a FDA allowed for the United States. Post-refractive menu. Kirsten, you can still hear me, right?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
I don't know what's going on my end, but I can't.
No,
I'm here.
You're a little garbled on my end. Okay, I'm just going to try to keep answering questions. So post-refractive, we have, are you touching upon this later, Kirsten?
Yes, I am going over post-refractive stuff in at the 5:30 webinar. So if you're joining at 5:30, I will be going over that. Also the calculator and
right.
You can join Crystal at 5:30.
I'll touch upon post-refractive very briefly because we're running out of time. But I can change this drop-down once we click IOL to post-refractive here. We utilize US because it will show us the anterior chamber depth, but if you're outside, you may want to select post-refractive to show aqueous depth. However, both will be utilized for your calculations. Bare minimum, if you do not have history, you need to select a bubble in each of these boxes. And then if you do have history, you can type in the values. So notice the top box on the left eye has pre-VC. So this is your patient's pre-vision correction surgery. And this is your stable post-op. And you type, you notate which procedure. And then when you go to the calculation screen, we will have post-refractive options. If you have history, we will have 4 formula options: Barrett, Truquet, Masket, Modified Masket, Shamus. And if you do not have history, we will have 2 formulas. And that was slightly a rush overview of post-refractive. We do have PDF guides. So if you'd like, please email us and we can help you more with that. Okay, let's see more. Kirsten's answering a bunch of questions for us in the chat. Thank you.
Hi.
Trying to keep up. Checklist. Tanya, if you are listening in, can you let us know if we're going to bump into any other webinars by going over our time right now?
I think there's one.
Carrie.
What was that, Tanya?
I was just making sure that you were able to hear me.
Yes.
Let me log in and ensure that nothing is scheduled, but okay. I think that we're clear to go. I think the only difficulty here is I feel like we need to wrap it up. Perhaps some of these technicians are in the office and the physician is counting on them to return to work. So I would just highly encourage that everybody whose questions did not get answered can send us an email and we can cover additional questions later.
Okay. All right, so please take pictures of our contact information. We're happy to help you. Please let us know. I already see emails coming in actually, which is great. And if you need any support, whether it's customer support or tech support for software updates, our phone number is here as well.
Carrie,
okay, I think we're good. Yeah.
There is another session.
Okay. All right. So then let's hop off. I'm going to try to copy these chat messages and paste them in a document just to have this log. And again, please send us an email. Thank you for attending. We appreciate every one of you that did attend. And we look forward to hearing with you to see if we can help you at all. All right.